Senator Rand Paul getting a lot of attention for his performance last night, trying to set himself apart from the rest of the pack, in part as a strong fiscal conservative. Here he is taking on Marco Rubio over the issue of military spending. Watch this.
But the family is the most important institution in
Nevertheless,
society.
it's not
and yes,
very
I do want to rebuild the American
Marco. How's
military.
it conservative?
I know that Rand is a committed isolationist. I'm not. I believe the world is a stronger and a better place when the United States is the strongest military power in the world.
Marco, how is it conservative? How is it conservative to add $1 trillion expenditure for the federal government that you're not paying for? How is it conservative? How is it conservative to add $1 trillion in military expenditures? You cannot be a conservative if you're going to keep promoting new programs that you're not going to pay for.
That was a big moment last night, joined now by Kentucky Senator Rand Paul. Senator, good morning. When you look back at that and you hear the whole thing back in your head, how did you feel about that exchange?
You know, I think it's one of the most important exchanges we can have and discussions we can have. We just raised the debt ceiling because people like Marco on one side want more military spending, but people on the left, like Chuck Schumer, want more domestic welfare spending. And the liberals and the right wing get together, but they're raising the spending caps, and we're getting further and further mired in debt. And I don't think we are a stronger nation the farther we are in debt. In fact, Admiral Mullen said that the greatest threat to our national security is our debt, and I agree with him.
You know, the comeback from Senator Rubio had to deal with the threats that we face from Putin, from ISIS, the creation of that China's building islands in the South Seas, and that we can't sort of just stand by and let that happen. Is he right?
I agree completely. Yeah, I agree completely. But, you know, we spend more on the military than the next 10 countries combined. You add Russia and China together and 8 more countries, and then you add up to what we spend. So we do spend a considerable amount. I'm as much for defense as the next person. I'm for a strong national defense, but I'm not for bankrupting the country in the process. So it's a good debate to have. How much is a good thing and how much is too much?
You know, it sort of felt at moments last night, and, you know, correct me if you think I'm wrong, that we were seeing the old Rand Paul, that you were kind of getting back to your knitting, the stuff that really put you on the map and got a lot of attention across this country, and maybe, you know, that attention that prompted you to run for president. Is that fair? Do you feel like you're sort of getting back to your, you know, your secret sauce, so to speak?
Yeah. You know what's funny about it is I feel like I've always been the same, but I got a moment to express myself. You know, I think the 90-second answers were helpful. Fox Business was very fair in the allotted time. What you saw was almost an equal amount of time for all 10 candidates, so each candidate has a moment to shine, and I think that does help quite a bit. So I think it's a format as much as anything, but I think my message kind of has been the same. It's funny how people say, oh, you've changed this or that. But I've always been somebody who, for the number one cause for me to run for office was the debt. And I think it's the number one thing that threatens our country.
But didn't you at some points sort of temper your language along the way when it came to the issue of being isolationist? You know, sort of having to say that you think that you have to engage with the enemies, you know, when they present a threat to this country. And it felt like so go ahead. Is that fair?
Well, I've spent a lot of time counteracting what I think is a wrong description because I'm not an isolationist. So in counteracting that, a lot of people say, oh, well, he's the opposite. Well, really, there's a spectrum from being never involved to being involved all of the time. And I've always said I'm more towards the middle, that there are times we will have to be involved. I would have voted to go to Afghanistan, you know, so it's not that I'm not for being involved. I'm also for being engaged diplomatically and for trade. So in some ways, the description is an inaccurate description, but it doesn't mean that I'm in love with most of the intervention in the Middle East. And I've always consistently said that toppling secular dictators over there has led to chaos and the rise of radical Islam.
Let me ask you this. You know, what do you think about the sort of show of force that we're doing right now? We had paratroopers sort of showing what we can do in Europe over the course of the past week. And there's discussion about, you know, really upping our numbers in Europe to show Putin that he better not mess with us, essentially. Would you be in favor of continuing to strengthen our sort of presence in Europe?
I think we do have obligations around the world. But I think that President Obama sending 50 people to war in Syria is the dumbest thing I've ever heard of. That's the most underwhelming use of force I've ever heard of. But part of it's because we haven't decided as a nation The Constitution says that Congress initiates war, and that's where we really ought to have a debate. And we shouldn't let the president unilaterally take us to war. But if we're going to war, you don't send 50 people into a war. That's absurd.
All right. So, looking at the numbers, we don't want to pull up national polls because I know that nobody feels that that's a good reflection. And, people can differ on that. But you're 11th in Iowa right now, and you're 9th in New Hampshire. So if you had a good night last night, how do you translate that into moving up in some of these polls?
I think the most important thing is to understand that the polls mean absolutely nothing. We had a poll in Kentucky a week before the governor's race, and they had the Republican down 5, and he won by 8. The polls are terrible. The polls aren't accurate at all. But even the polls that people are reporting, 75% of the people in the polls are undecided. So this race is wide open, and we shouldn't use the polls to discount anyone at this point. I think any one of the 8 people on the stage last night can win, and I think we ought to report on the campaigns and see what happens.
All right. We will see what happens. Senator Paul, thank you. Good to see you this morning.